A Koch network-backed political advocacy group, Americans for Prosperity, has been pressuring Senator Joe Manchin to oppose key items in President Joe Biden's agenda. This, according to a new CNBC report.
Now, the group has been lobbying the West Virginia senator to oppose agenda items like reforms to the filibuster and voting rights, and given Manchin's recent op-ed, their efforts appear to be working. I will say right off the bat, I'm not sure that Joe Manchin wrote that op-ed because of the Koch brothers groups. I think that's probably a little conspiratorial and overdramatic. It reminds me of when Sheldon Whitehouse pulled a Charlie Day and got his little board out at the Senate hearing and made all of these different connections, which on the right, I can just sort of tell you from behind the scenes, there is money going to different places and it does matter, but people also actually do have an ideology that guide them in certain directions. Joe Manchin has political interests that are guiding him in certain directions that the Koch groups alone, like Americans for Prosperity, aren't, they're almost reflecting what some of those political interests are. That's not to say they aren't driving any of it. They do have a lot of money. They can run ads that would absolutely hurt Manchin. But at the same time, I kind of think Joe Manchin would have written that op-ed, regardless of whether the Koch groups specifically were lobbying him on this.
Right. And the Koch campaign, though, is pretty clever. If you recall, they helped and they allied with elements of the Tea Party, which was, extraordinarily partisan, saying that the Republican Party as it was, wasn't being strong enough. Now the Kochs have shifted over to actually bipartisanship is a great thing. Mm-hmm. And they're putting a lot of that pressure right on Joe Manchin to say, all of your instincts that you say about working across the aisle, yes, that's exactly right. And so now they're celebrating the virtues of bipartisanship, which is kind of hilarious coming from them. But it fits exactly with Joe Manchin's own self-mythology. Now, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took Manchin to task for his balking on filibuster reform and other key Democratic legislation. Let's take a listen.
H.R. 1 stands up against lobbyists and dark money. And I would reckon to think that this is probably just as much a part of Joe Manchin's calculus as anything else. Because when it comes to this bipartisan argument, I got to tell you, I don't buy it. Because Joe Manchin has voted for bills that have not been bipartisan before. Look at the American Rescue Plan. So this is not just about bipartisanship. This is, I think, because you look at the Koch brothers and you look at organizations like the Heritage Foundation and conservative lobby groups that are doing a victory lap, claiming victory over the fact that Manchin refuses to change on the filibuster. And I think that these two things are very closely intertwined. And I think that there's a desire to make this just about protecting the franchise. But protecting our democracy is also about making sure that we give lobbyists and dark money groups, which are funding these attacks on the right to vote, the boot. But, corporate money has a very, very tight grip on both parties. And I think that has to do with the calculus in this situation that people aren't really discussing enough.
And what gets lost in this conversation is that a lot of the things that he's blocking, voting rights, infrastructure, union reform, these are things that actually have lots of bipartisan support among the public. Where they don't have bipartisan support is in the United States Senate. So who cares? It seems to Manchin, as long as he has Lisa Murkowski, then it's bipartisan. So if he really wants things to be bipartisan and he cares so much about whether it's a D or R by the name, he could switch and become a Republican, caucus with Democrats.
He could.
He already co-sponsored H.R. 1 last session. Now he can re-co-sponsor it as a Republican, and boom, it's bipartisan. Now, I don't think any of that's actually going to happen, but that ought to expose the absurdity, because the legislation is precisely the same.
Right. No, it does expose the absurdity. It's just like magic, right? You could be a Democrat or a Republican.
Now
it's like Arlen Specter.
Yes.
There he is. No, and I mean, I think as somebody on the right who does know people at these groups and like runs in these circles, Koch groups actually don't have a lot of goodwill on the right now. That's not to say they don't have a lot of money, because they do, but people are pretty frustrated with them exactly for the reason you just said, Ryan, which is that in the Tea Party, groups like AFP, Americans for Prosperity, were really instrumental in organizing grassroots support for the Tea Party agenda, and were hardcore. They were not bipartisan. They were working for, these partisan Republican priorities, conservative movement priorities. And now that has sort of been rethought, the kind of corporatism on the right, as that's been rethought in the Trump era, the Koch groups have lost a lot of goodwill, and I think rightfully so in certain cases on certain issues. And so I think their power is actually waning. And I'd also just like to say, the specific Koch conspiracy is really laughable to me on a lot of different issues. Like Jane Mayer's piece in the New Yorker this week about how senators were taking calls with Koch groups. It's just written with such a conspiratorial framework, when in fact lots of groups with lots of money are doing this. It's not just the Kochs. The Kochs don't have this singular influence over Republicans, at least not anymore. And so I would just as somebody on the right who's very concerned about money and politics, speaking to people on the left, I would say, look elsewhere other than the Kochs. Broaden the aperture here. They're not Darth Vader. They're not, behind the curtain. It's not just them. It's the whole thing. It's the whole system.
Yeah, and I wish the Kochs were our only problem. We could deal with them. Tomorrow on Rising, founder and director of the Revolving Door Project, Jeff Hauser, joins us to discuss President Biden's judicial nominees. We also talk to friend of the show, Matt Taibbi.
Team Rising is going to be in the house as usual. Can't wait for that. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We will see you tomorrow. Hope you all have a great afternoon.
Yep, happy whatever day it is.
Yes, see you then.